Nobody stopped for the old man that night, and by sunrise, an entire city would wish they had. The wind cut sharply through downtown Columbus, Ohio, carrying the first real chill of autumn across the crowded sidewalks. People hurried past glowing storefronts with their heads down and their hands buried in their pockets. Traffic lights reflected against damp pavement left behind by an afternoon drizzle. The city was moving fast, and nobody seemed interested in slowing down. Ethan Walker understood that feeling better than most. He adjusted the strap of his worn delivery bag and stepped out of a small grocery store carrying 2 discounted bags of food. Every dollar mattered. Every decision mattered. At 39 years old, he was raising his 9-year-old daughter alone while juggling 2 jobs and a growing stack of bills that never seemed to shrink. It was not the life he imagined years ago, but it was the life he had, and he faced it the same way he faced everything else. Quietly, one day at a time. His phone buzzed. A message from Lucy appeared on the screen. "Dad, did you remember the pancake syrup?" Ethan smiled immediately. He typed back, "It is safely in the bag." A second message appeared. "You are the best dad in Ohio." Ethan laughed softly as he crossed the street. That title felt more valuable than anything money could buy. The warmth from Lucy's message stayed with him as he continued toward the bus stop. The evening crowd flowed around him like a river. Business professionals rushed toward parking garages. College students hurried toward restaurants. Delivery drivers loaded vehicles. Nobody paid much attention to anyone else. Then Ethan noticed something unusual. Near a bench beside a closed pharmacy stood an elderly man. He looked lost, not confused in a dramatic way, just disconnected from the movement around him. He wore a dark overcoat that looked expensive but old. His silver hair moved in the wind. One hand rested on a wooden cane while the other held a folded piece of paper. Several people brushed past him. One woman glanced his way before continuing down the sidewalk. A young man removed an earbud long enough to shake his head and keep walking. The old man seemed to be trying to ask questions, but nobody stayed long enough to listen. Ethan slowed his pace. He watched for a moment. The elderly man approached another passerby. The conversation lasted less than 3 seconds before the stranger pointed vaguely down the street and continued walking. Something about the scene bothered him. Maybe it was the loneliness. Maybe it was the uncertainty in the man's eyes. Maybe it was because Ethan remembered how quickly people could become invisible when life became difficult. He started walking again, then stopped. The bus would arrive in 7 minutes. Lucy was waiting at home. Dinner still needed to be made. Bills still needed to be paid. He had every reason to keep moving. Yet his feet refused to cooperate. Ethan turned around. The old man was still standing there, alone. The wind lifted loose newspaper pages across the sidewalk. City lights flickered on as darkness settled over the streets. Ethan approached slowly. "Sir." The elderly man looked up. His blue eyes appeared tired but kind. "Yes. Are you all right?" Relief immediately crossed the man's face. Not dramatic relief. The quiet kind that appears when someone finally feels seen. "I hope so," he said with a small smile. "I seem to be having a little trouble." Ethan nodded toward the folded paper. "Can I help?" The man looked down at it. "That is part of the problem." Ethan waited patiently. The old man unfolded the paper and stared at it. "I know where I was supposed to go." He paused. "I just cannot seem to remember how to get there." Ethan studied him carefully. There was no smell of alcohol, no sign of danger, just uncertainty, the kind that often comes with age. Around them, hundreds of people continued moving through the city without slowing down. Cars passed. Horns sounded. Store doors opened and closed. Nobody noticed the conversation taking place beside the bench. "Do you have family nearby?" Ethan asked gently. The old man hesitated. "I believe so." Ethan blinked. "You believe so?" The man gave an embarrassed laugh. "That sounds strange, does it not?" Ethan felt concern growing. A little. The old man looked down the street, as if searching for something hidden beyond the lights. "My name is Harold Bennett." He extended a trembling hand. Ethan shook it. "Ethan Walker." Harold smiled warmly. "Thank you for stopping, Ethan." Ethan glanced at the bus pulling toward the curb across the street. He could still make it if he hurried. Instead, he watched it arrive without him. Then he looked back at the elderly man standing alone beneath the city lights. For reasons he could not explain, Ethan suddenly had the feeling that walking away would be a mistake he would remember for the rest of his life. Ethan Walker watched the bus doors close across the street. A moment later, the vehicle pulled away, carrying dozens of passengers toward warm homes, evening meals, and familiar routines. He should have been on it. Instead, he stood beside a stranger named Harold Bennett beneath the glow of a street lamp. The wind swept through downtown Columbus again, carrying dry leaves across the sidewalk. Harold tightened his grip on the cane and looked apologetic. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "You probably have somewhere important to be." Ethan glanced at the grocery bags in his hands. "My daughter is waiting for dinner." Harold's expression immediately fell. "Then you should go." Ethan looked at the older man. Something about him felt genuine. Not helpless, not dramatic, just alone. "Let us see if we can figure this out first." Relief returned to Harold's face. "That is very kind." Ethan smiled faintly. "My daughter would be disappointed if I left someone stranded." Harold chuckled softly. "She sounds like a good kid." "She is." Ethan pulled out his phone. "Do you have a phone?" Harold checked his coat pockets, then his other pockets, then looked confused. "I thought I did." Ethan frowned. "You are not sure?" Harold laughed awkwardly. "I'm not sure about several things tonight." The honesty was unsettling. Ethan had seen elderly people become disoriented before. His own grandfather had experienced similar moments near the end of his life. The memory made him more patient. "Do you remember your address?" Ethan asked. Harold unfolded the piece of paper again. Several numbers and names were scribbled across it. "I thought it was written here." He stared at the page for several seconds. "Now I cannot tell what any of this means." Ethan carefully examined the paper. The handwriting looked rushed. There was no clear address, no emergency contact, no useful information, just fragments. Harold shook his head. "This is embarrassing." "It is okay." "No, it is not." Harold looked toward the crowded street. A man reaches a certain age, and suddenly everyone looks at him differently. Ethan remained silent. Harold continued. "People stop seeing who you are. They only see what you cannot do anymore." The words carried unexpected weight. Ethan recognized the feeling. Not because of age, because of struggle. When money became tight after his wife passed away, people sometimes looked at him differently too. Not cruelly, just differently, as though hardship had quietly reduced his value. "For what it is worth," Ethan said, "I think most people are fighting battles nobody else can see." Harold looked at him carefully. Then he smiled. "That is a wise thing to say." Ethan laughed. "I stole it from experience." His phone vibrated. Lucy's name appeared again. He answered immediately. "Hey, sweetheart. You missed dinner time." "I know. That sounds serious." Ethan smiled. "A little. Are you okay?" "I am fine." He glanced toward Harold. "I met someone who needs help." There was a brief pause. "An old person?" Lucy asked. Ethan laughed. "How did you guess?" "Because you always help old people." Harold smiled while listening to the conversation. "Well," Lucy continued, "you have to help him." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I do, yes." "And why is that?" "Because if Grandpa was lost somewhere, I would want somebody to help him." Ethan closed his eyes for a second. "Sometimes children arrive at the truth faster than adults." "You make a strong argument." "I know. I might be late." "That is okay." Her voice softened. "Just do the right thing." The call ended. Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket. Harold looked emotional. "She sounds wonderful. She keeps me honest." Harold nodded slowly. "That is a gift." Darkness continued settling over the city. Storefront lights glowed brighter. Office workers disappeared into parking garages. The sidewalk gradually became less crowded. Ethan checked the time. Then he made a decision. "Have you eaten dinner?" Harold blinked. "I do not believe so." "Do you remember when you last ate?" Harold thought for several seconds. "Not really." Ethan sighed. "Okay." Harold looked concerned. "What?" "We are going to get some food." "You do not have to do that." "Maybe not." Ethan picked up the grocery bags. "But I am doing it anyway." Harold stared at him. "Why?" Ethan smiled. "Because my daughter already told me what the right thing to do is." For the first time that evening, genuine warmth reached Harold's eyes. Together, they began walking down the sidewalk toward a small family diner glowing beneath a red neon sign. Neither man realized that before the night was over, a simple act of kindness would begin changing both of their lives forever. The neon sign outside the diner buzzed softly against the darkening sky as Ethan Walker pushed open the glass door and held it for Harold Bennett. Warm air wrapped around them immediately. The scent of coffee, grilled sandwiches, and fresh pie filled the room. A few customers sat in booths along the windows while an old country song drifted quietly from speakers overhead. It was the kind of place that had survived decades because people trusted it. Ethan liked places like that. They reminded him that not everything in the world needed to change. Harold paused near the entrance and looked around with a strange expression. Not confusion, recognition. As though the simple diner reminded him of something he could almost remember. "Everything all right?" Ethan asked. Harold nodded slowly. "This place feels familiar." Ethan smiled. "That is usually a good sign." They settled into a booth near the back. A waitress named Carol approached carrying menus. She knew Ethan by name. "Running late tonight," she said. Ethan laughed. "Story of my life." Carol noticed Harold and smiled warmly. "And who is your friend?" Harold seemed surprised by the question. "I suppose I am still figuring that out myself." Carol laughed politely, assuming it was a joke. A few minutes later, coffee arrived for Harold and a simple dinner special for Ethan. Harold stared at the menu longer than necessary. "Would you like me to recommend something?" Ethan asked. "Please. The chicken soup is excellent." Harold nodded. "Then I trust your judgment." As they waited for their food, Ethan tried again to piece together the mystery. "Do you remember where you were heading tonight?" Harold folded his hands together. "Not exactly. Do you live in Columbus?" "I think so." Ethan blinked. "You think so?" Harold sighed. "That answer sounds worse every time I say it." Ethan could not help smiling. "A little." Harold smiled too. For a moment, the worry disappeared from his face. Then he looked out the window toward the passing traffic. "The strange thing is that I remember many things very clearly." "Like what?" Harold thought for a moment. "I remember working long hours." "Doing what?" "Building something." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "What kind of something?" Harold frowned. "That is the problem." He tapped his temple gently. "I can see pieces of it. Meetings. Offices. People asking questions. People expecting answers." He shook his head. "But whenever I try to grab the details, they disappear." Ethan listened carefully. The description sounded important, yet it remained frustratingly incomplete. Their meals arrived. Ethan laughed. "I have been told that once or twice." The conversation drifted toward easier subjects. Harold asked about Lucy. Ethan spoke about school projects, soccer practice, and her endless talent for turning ordinary days into adventures. Every time Ethan mentioned his daughter, something changed in Harold's expression. He listened closely, carefully, almost as though he were studying something valuable. "You talk about her with great pride," Harold observed. Ethan smiled. "She deserves it. Being a parent is not easy." Ethan looked down briefly. "No," Harold waited. "Her mother passed away 5 years ago." The words still carried weight even after all that time. Harold's face softened immediately. "I am sorry." Ethan nodded. "Thank you." Silence settled between them for a moment. Outside, headlights moved across the wet streets. Inside, coffee cups clinked softly against saucers. Harold finally spoke. "You must miss her." Ethan looked toward the window. "Every day." Harold lowered his eyes. "I imagine that kind of loss changes a person." Ethan thought about that. "It does." "How?" Ethan smiled faintly. "You stop worrying about things that do not matter." Harold nodded slowly, as though those words carried special meaning. Then he reached into his coat pocket. His expression changed instantly. Surprise flashed across his face. "That is strange." Ethan looked up. "What?" Harold removed a thick, sealed envelope. The paper was expensive. The envelope itself looked important. Yet Harold stared at it with complete confusion. "I do not remember putting this here." Ethan studied it carefully. There was no address visible. No markings. Just a name written neatly across the front. Harold Bennett. The old man turned it over in his hands. "I have never seen this before." Ethan suddenly had the feeling that the answers Harold could not remember might be closer than either of them realized. Harold Bennett turned the envelope over several times beneath the warm diner lights. The paper looked expensive, the kind used for important documents. Yet his confusion appeared completely genuine. Ethan Walker watched carefully. "Are you sure you have never seen it before?" Harold shook his head. "I would remember something like this." He ran a finger along the sealed edge. "At least I think I would." Ethan smiled gently. "That answer is becoming a theme tonight." Harold laughed softly. Unfortunately. Around them the diner continued its evening rhythm. Coffee was poured. Plates clinked. Conversations drifted from booth to booth. Outside, the city moved beneath streetlights and cool autumn air. Inside, time seemed slower. Safer. Harold stared at the envelope again. Perhaps I should open it. Probably. Harold nodded and carefully broke the seal. A folded letter rested inside. Nothing else. No photographs. No business cards. No obvious clues. He unfolded the page and began reading. Almost immediately his expression changed. Ethan leaned forward. What is it? Harold blinked several times. I do not know. You do not understand it? I understand the words. Harold looked genuinely unsettled. I just do not remember why they matter. Ethan waited patiently. Harold handed him the letter. Maybe you can make more sense of it. Ethan hesitated. Are you sure? Please. Ethan glanced down at the page. The letter was brief. Formal. It referenced an important meeting scheduled for the following morning. There were mentions of board members, presentations, and a private transportation arrangement. Several names appeared throughout the document. Most meant nothing to Ethan. One thing stood out. Whoever wrote the letter clearly expected Harold to attend something important. Very important. Does any of this look familiar? Ethan asked. Harold studied the page. No, none of it. Harold pointed toward one sentence. That phrase feels familiar. Which one? Legacy planning. Ethan read it again. Do you know what it means? Harold leaned back slowly. I feel like I should. The answer worried Ethan more than he expected. Harold seemed intelligent, educated, thoughtful, yet entire sections of his memory appeared disconnected. Not gone, just hidden behind a locked door. Carol returned to refill their coffee. Everything okay over here? Ethan glanced at Harold. We are working on that. Carol smiled kindly at the older man. Well, you picked the right person to help. Harold looked amused. Did I? Absolutely. Carol pointed toward Ethan. This man cannot walk past a problem without trying to fix it. Ethan laughed. That is not true. It is completely true. Carol walked away before he could argue. Harold smiled. She seems certain. She has known me a long time. Then perhaps she knows what she is talking about. Ethan shook his head, but the comment stayed with him. The truth was that helping people often complicated his life. It cost time, sometimes money, sometimes opportunities. Yet he never seemed capable of choosing otherwise. Across the table, Harold folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. I wish I remembered. Ethan nodded. I know. Do you ever think about how strange memory is? Harold asked. Not often. One moment your entire life feels solid. Harold looked out the window. Then suddenly pieces begin drifting away like leaves in the wind. Ethan followed his gaze toward the dark street outside. The image felt unexpectedly sad. Maybe they come back. Harold smiled faintly. That sounds optimistic. My daughter says optimism is just stubborn hope. Harold laughed warmly. I would like to meet this daughter someday. Ethan smiled. You would probably get along. His phone vibrated as if on cue. Lucy again. Ethan answered immediately. Hey, sweetheart. Status report. Still helping. Good. Ethan laughed. That was quick. I already decided you were not allowed to quit. Harold smiled while listening. Lucy continued. Did the old man eat dinner? Ethan looked at Harold. Yes. Good. Anything else? Tell him hello. Ethan held the phone slightly toward Harold. Lucy says hello. Harold's eyes softened. Please tell Lucy thank you. Ethan relayed the message. Lucy sounded pleased. After the call ended, silence settled comfortably between the two men. It was not awkward. It felt familiar somehow, like two people who had known each other longer than a few hours. Then Ethan noticed something through the diner window. Across the street, a black luxury sedan had slowly pulled to the curb. The vehicle remained parked with its headlights on. Two men in dark suits stepped out and began scanning the sidewalk. Their expressions looked concerned. Very concerned. Ethan frowned slightly. A strange feeling moved through him. Across the table, Harold happened to glance outside as well. The moment he saw the men, his face changed. Not recognition exactly. Something deeper. Something closer to instinct. And for the first time all evening, Ethan realized that Harold Bennett might not be as ordinary as he appeared. The two men outside the diner remained near the black sedan, scanning the street with growing concern. Their suits were expensive. Their posture was professional. They were clearly searching for someone. Ethan Walker watched them through the window while Harold Bennett sat unusually still across the table. The old man's eyes followed the men for several seconds before he looked away. Do you know them? Ethan asked gently. Harold hesitated. I'm not sure. The answer sounded familiar by now, yet something felt different this time. Harold was not confused. He seemed conflicted, as though a memory lingered just beyond reach. Outside, one of the men checked his phone while the other spoke into a small earpiece. Neither entered the diner. They simply continued watching the street. Ethan looked back at Harold. Do they look familiar at all? Harold stared into his coffee cup. Perhaps. Perhaps. Harold sighed. There are moments tonight when things feel close. Like a song you almost remember. Ethan nodded slowly. And right now? Harold glanced toward the window again. Right now feels like one of those moments. The answer settled between them. Carol stopped by with the check and noticed both men looking outside. Something interesting happening? Ethan smiled politely. Not sure yet. Carol followed his gaze. Those men have been sitting out there for 10 minutes. Harold seemed surprised. Really? Long enough for me to notice. She lowered her voice. Friends of yours? Harold looked genuinely uncertain. I wish I knew. Carol offered a sympathetic smile before returning to the counter. The diner had become quieter as the evening continued. A few customers left. The country music drifted softly through nearly empty booths. Beyond the windows, downtown Columbus glowed beneath streetlights and cool autumn air. Ethan checked the time. Lucy would still be awake, but not for much longer. He needed to get home. Yet every instinct told him that leaving Harold alone was not the right choice. His phone vibrated again. Lucy. Hey, sweetheart. How is the mission going? Ethan laughed. Complicated. That means you still do not know where he lives. Correct. Do you trust him? The question surprised Ethan. He looked across the booth. Harold sat quietly, studying the folded envelope. Yes, Ethan answered honestly. Then you should keep helping. That is your professional opinion? Absolutely. Ethan smiled. Thank you, counselor. Lucy giggled. You are welcome. Before ending the call, she added something unexpected. Dad. Yeah. Sometimes people get lost because they are scared. Ethan glanced at Harold again. What makes you say that? Because when I get scared, I forget things too. The line went quiet for a moment. Good night, Dad. Good night, sweetheart. After the call ended, Ethan sat thoughtfully. Children often saw truths adults missed. Across the table, Harold looked curious. What did she say this time? Ethan smiled. She thinks people sometimes forget things when they are frightened. Harold stared at the table. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. Your daughter may be wiser than both of us. Ethan noticed a subtle change in his expression. Not confusion. Sadness. The kind that comes from remembering something painful. Harold, the old man looked up. Yes. Are you scared of something? The question lingered in the air. Outside, a city bus rolled past. Inside, dishes clinked softly in the kitchen. Harold took a slow breath. I do not know. That is okay. Harold looked down at his hands. The strange thing is that I keep feeling like tomorrow is important. Ethan frowned slightly. Because of the letter? Maybe. Harold touched the envelope. Every time I look at it, I feel pressure. What kind of pressure? Responsibility. The word emerged instantly, more confidently than anything Harold had said all evening. Both men noticed it. Harold blinked. That was strange. What was? For a second, I knew exactly what I meant. Ethan leaned forward. Tell me. Harold stared beyond the booth as though watching distant memories drift through the diner. People were depending on me. His voice became softer. A lot of people. Ethan felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. Before he could respond, the diner door suddenly opened. Cold air swept inside. One of the men from the black sedan stepped through the entrance. He looked around the room. His eyes landed on Harold immediately. Relief flooded his face. Absolute relief. Then he spoke 4 words that caused the entire evening to change. Mr. Bennett, we found you. The words hung in the air like the final piece of a puzzle suddenly falling into place. Mr. Bennett, we found you. The man standing near the diner entrance looked relieved enough to collapse into the nearest chair. Behind him, the second man entered quickly, his expression carrying the same mixture of concern and gratitude. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Harold Bennett simply stared at them. Something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition. Not complete. Not yet. But stronger than anything Ethan Walker had seen all evening. Do I know you? Harold asked softly. The first man smiled, though emotion was visible beneath his professional composure. Yes, sir. Harold blinked. I do. My name is Michael Ross. He stepped closer. I have worked with you for 12 years. Harold studied him carefully. 12 years. Michael nodded. Yes, sir. The second man introduced himself. David Turner. 7 years. Harold looked overwhelmed. I am sorry. Please do not apologize, Michael replied immediately. We have been worried about you. Ethan remained quietly seated, watching the scene unfold. The concern appeared genuine. These were not strangers collecting an elderly man from the street. They clearly knew him, respected him, perhaps even cared about him. Carol glanced over from the counter, sensing something important was happening. Around them, the few remaining customers lowered their voices instinctively. How did you find me? Harold asked. Michael exhaled. We have been searching for hours. Hours? Since late afternoon. Harold looked down at the table. I did not realize. Michael's eyes shifted toward Ethan. Was he alone when you found him? Ethan nodded. Near a pharmacy downtown. Michael shook his head slowly. Thank God. The sincerity of the statement caught Ethan's attention. Michael stepped closer and extended his hand. I do not know who you are, but thank you. Ethan stood and shook it. Anybody would have done the same. David and Michael exchanged a quick glance. Then David smiled politely. Actually, sir, most people did not. The comment lingered. Ethan remembered the dozens of pedestrians who had walked past Harold earlier that evening. Nobody had been cruel. They simply had not stopped. Michael looked toward the empty soup bowl and coffee cup. Did you buy him dinner? Ethan shrugged. He looked hungry. Michael closed his eyes briefly as though trying to absorb everything. You have no idea how much that means. Harold watched the conversation quietly. I feel as though I am missing something important. Michael immediately softened his tone. You do not need to worry about anything tonight. I dislike not understanding what is happening. I know. Michael smiled gently. That part sounds exactly like you. For the first time all evening, Harold laughed. It was a small laugh, but genuine. The sound seemed to reassure everyone. Michael carefully pulled out a chair. May we sit? Harold nodded. Over the next several minutes, Michael and David filled in pieces of the story. Not everything. They seemed careful not to overwhelm him. They explained that Harold had attended several meetings earlier that day before unexpectedly leaving alone. When he failed to arrive at a scheduled event, concern quickly spread. Phone calls followed. Security teams were notified. Search efforts began. Ethan listened politely. The explanation raised as many questions as it answered. What kind of elderly man required security teams? What type of meetings created this level of urgency? Yet he chose not to ask. Harold already seemed exhausted. The night had become complicated enough. Eventually, Michael glanced at his watch. We should get you home, sir. Harold looked uncertain. Home? Yes. Will I recognize it? The question struck everyone differently. Michael hid his reaction well, but sadness briefly crossed his face. I think so. Harold nodded slowly. Then his attention shifted toward Ethan. Before I go. Ethan looked up. Yes. Harold studied him for several seconds. The diner suddenly felt very quiet. Thank you. Ethan smiled. You do not need to thank me. I do. Harold's voice carried unusual certainty. Most people were busy. Ethan shrugged. People have responsibilities. So do you. Harold glanced toward the grocery bags still sitting beside the booth. Yet you stayed. Ethan looked away for a moment. My daughter would not have forgiven me if I left. Harold laughed softly. I would like to meet this remarkable child someday. Ethan smiled. Maybe you will. A strange expression crossed Harold's face. Almost instinctive. Almost prophetic. I think I will. Neither man understood why those words felt important. Moments later, Michael helped Harold to his feet. The elderly man collected the mysterious envelope and slipped it into his coat pocket. Then he turned back toward Ethan one final time. You gave a stranger your evening. Ethan smiled. It was just a few hours. Harold shook his head gently. No, his blue eyes held a depth that seemed larger than the moment itself. Some hours change everything. Then, surrounded by the two men who had spent hours searching for him, Harold Bennett walked slowly toward the diner door. Ethan watched him disappear into the cool autumn night, completely unaware that the greatest chapter of this story had not even begun. The black sedan disappeared into the flow of downtown traffic, its taillights fading beneath the glow of streetlights and office towers. Ethan Walker remained standing outside the diner for a moment, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the empty street where Harold Bennett had been only minutes earlier. The night felt strangely quiet now, as if something important had happened without fully revealing itself. Carol stepped outside carrying a trash bag and smiled at him. You look like somebody who just finished reading the first chapter of a mystery novel. Ethan laughed. That obvious? A little. She tied the bag and glanced toward the street. Who was he? Ethan shook his head. Honestly, I do not know. Carol nodded thoughtfully. Well, whoever he is. Those men looked relieved enough to cry when they found him. Ethan smiled faintly. I noticed. The comment stayed with him all the way home. 20 minutes later, he pulled into the small driveway of his modest house. The porch light was still on. A familiar silhouette waited at the front window. Before he even reached the door, it flew open. Lucy rushed forward. Finally, Ethan laughed. Good evening to you too. You are very late. I know. The pancakes suffered greatly. Ethan stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The familiar warmth of home immediately replaced the cold autumn air. I heard they survived. Lucy crossed her arms dramatically. Barely. Ethan smiled and set down the grocery bags. I met your friend. My friend. The old man you ordered me to help. Lucy grinned. How is he? Ethan paused. That is complicated. For the next half hour, he told her everything. The confusion. The diner. The envelope. The men searching for Harold. Lucy listened with complete attention, occasionally interrupting with questions only a 9-year-old could ask. Did he like the soup? Yes. Did he smile? Several times. Good. Ethan laughed. That seems important to you. It is. Lucy climbed onto a kitchen stool. Lonely people should smile more. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Sometimes she said things that felt older than her years. I think Harold would agree. The rest of the evening passed peacefully. Homework was checked. Pancakes were eventually made. Dishes were washed. Yet long after Lucy had gone to bed, Ethan found himself thinking about the strange encounter. Sitting alone at the kitchen table, he replayed pieces of the evening in his mind. The expensive envelope. The luxury sedan. The concern in Michael's voice. The word responsibility. None of it fit together. Eventually he shook his head. Whatever Harold's story was, it belonged to Harold. Life had a way of bringing strangers together briefly before sending them in different directions. By midnight, Ethan was asleep. Across the city, however, another conversation was taking place. Inside an elegant estate surrounded by tall trees and security gates, Harold Bennett sat in a quiet study beside a fireplace. Michael and David remained nearby. A physician had completed an examination only minutes earlier. The results were reassuring. Harold was physically healthy. Exhausted, but healthy. Yet his thoughts remained fixed on one thing. The father. Michael looked up. Sir. The man from the diner. Michael smiled. Ethan. Harold nodded slowly. Yes. For reasons he could not fully explain, that name felt important. Tell me about him. Michael exchanged a glance with David. We do not know much. Find out. The request carried more authority than anything Harold had said all evening. Even with fragments of memory missing, leadership still seemed woven into his instincts. Michael nodded immediately. Of course. Harold stared into the fireplace. Flames reflected softly in his eyes. Most people walked past. Neither man spoke. Harold continued. He stayed. The room grew quiet. Finally, David smiled. Not many people would do that these days. Harold shook his head gently. That is exactly why it matters. Upstairs, a grandfather clock marked the passing hour. Outside, wind moved through the trees. Harold closed his eyes briefly. Images drifted through his thoughts. A diner booth. A cup of coffee. A little girl on a telephone defending a stranger she had never met. The memories felt unusually clear. Clearer than many others. Michael. Yes, sir. Harold opened his eyes. Tomorrow feels important. Michael smiled carefully. It is. Harold looked toward the envelope resting on a nearby desk. Then perhaps tomorrow will help me remember who I am. Michael followed his gaze. Perhaps. Yet neither man realized that tomorrow would reveal far more than Harold's identity. It would uncover a connection that neither Ethan nor Lucy could possibly imagine, and before another day ended, a struggling single father would find himself standing at the edge of a world he never knew existed. The next morning arrived with clear skies and bright autumn sunlight spilling across Columbus. Ethan Walker was already awake before dawn. Habit had trained him that way. He packed Lucy's lunch, signed a school permission slip, and flipped pancakes while she sat at the kitchen counter describing a science project with the seriousness of a government briefing. The volcano must be realistic, she explained. That sounds important. Extremely. Ethan smiled as he poured orange juice into a glass. For a few minutes, life felt wonderfully ordinary. Yet somewhere in the back of his mind, he kept thinking about Harold Bennett. The old man had occupied his thoughts more than any stranger should. Perhaps it was the confusion in his eyes. Perhaps it was the loneliness. Or perhaps it was the strange feeling that their brief encounter was not truly over. After dropping Lucy at school, Ethan headed toward the warehouse where he worked part-time. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. Deliveries arrived. Inventory was checked. Pallets were moved. Hours slipped by. Around 11:30, Ethan was carrying a clipboard across the loading area when his phone vibrated. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. He almost ignored it. Almost. Something told him not to. Hello. A professional voice answered immediately. May I speak with Ethan Walker? This is Ethan. Good morning, Mr. Walker. My name is Michael Ross. Ethan stopped walking. The name registered instantly. Michael. Yes, sir. Ethan moved toward a quieter corner of the warehouse. Is Harold okay? He is safe. Relief washed through Ethan before he even realized he had been worried. Michael continued. Mr. Bennett asked me to contact you. Ethan blinked. He did. Yes. Why? There was a brief pause. He would like to see you. Ethan frowned. See me? If possible. Today. Yes. Ethan looked around the warehouse. Forklifts moved in the distance. Coworkers crossed the floor carrying boxes. Everything felt normal except the conversation happening through his phone. Michael, I am not sure I understand. That makes two of us. Ethan laughed despite himself. Fair enough. Michael's tone softened. Mr. Bennett has been asking about you since early this morning. Really? Repeatedly. Ethan did not know what to say. He remembers me? Very clearly. That answer surprised him more than anything else. According to Michael, Harold struggled with many details from the previous day. Yet somehow he remembered a struggling single father he had known for only a few hours. Where is he? Ethan asked. Michael provided an address on the north side of the city. Ethan quickly wrote it down. Then he noticed something. He talks about her often. After the call ended, Ethan stood silently for several seconds. None of it made sense. Later that afternoon, after receiving permission to leave work early, he picked Lucy up from school. She climbed into the truck carrying a backpack that appeared heavier than she was. Good day, Ethan asked. Excellent. Why? My volcano has international potential. Ethan laughed. That is good news. As they drove across town, he explained Michael's call. Lucy listened carefully. So the old man wants to see us? Apparently. Then we should go. You are not curious? Very. She smiled. But curious and scared are different things. Ethan glanced at her. You are not scared? Lucy shook her head. Good people usually find each other again. The answer lingered in the truck as they approached the address Michael had provided. Then they turned onto a private road lined with enormous oak trees. Moments later, Ethan's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Beyond a set of elegant iron gates stood one of the largest estates he had ever seen. And suddenly, for the first time since meeting Harold Bennett, Ethan realized that whatever story he had stepped into was far bigger than he imagined. The iron gates opened silently as Ethan Walker guided his aging pickup truck onto the long private driveway. Lucy pressed her face against the window. Dad, I see it. No, I mean really see it. Ethan laughed softly. Trust me, I see it. The estate stretched across acres of perfectly maintained grounds. Stone pathways wound through gardens. Tall fountains reflected afternoon sunlight. The main residence looked less like a house and more like a historic landmark. Ethan had delivered packages to wealthy neighborhoods before, but nothing compared to this. As they approached the circular entrance, several luxury vehicles came into view. Men and women in business attire moved between them carrying folders and briefcases. The atmosphere felt professional, organized, and important. Very important. Before Ethan could park, Michael Ross appeared at the front steps. He descended quickly with a genuine smile. Mr. Walker. Ethan stepped from the truck. Please call me Ethan. Michael nodded. Thank you for coming. Lucy climbed out beside her father and waved. Hello. Michael's expression immediately softened. You must be Lucy. She looked surprised. You know my name? Very well. Michael smiled. Mr. Bennett has mentioned you several times. Lucy glanced at Ethan with wide eyes. Ethan was equally confused. Together, they followed Michael toward the entrance. The massive front doors opened before they reached them. Inside, Polished wood floors reflected warm light from crystal fixtures overhead. Portraits lined the walls. Elegant furniture filled spacious rooms. Yet despite the wealth surrounding them, Ethan noticed something unexpected. The atmosphere felt less like a palace and more like a home. A very large home, but a home nonetheless. "This way," Michael said. As they moved through the hallway, Ethan's attention drifted toward a series of framed photographs. The first showed Harold standing beside a group of employees decades earlier. The second showed Harold cutting a ribbon at the opening of a major building. The third showed Harold shaking hands with governors, mayors, and business leaders. Ethan slowed his pace. Then he stopped completely. An entire wall was dedicated to one name. Bennett. Company awards. Corporate milestones. Newspaper headlines. Magazine covers. Lucy noticed it too. "Dad." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "That is him." Ethan stared silently. Harold Bennett. Founder. Chairman Emeritus. Bennett Global Enterprises. The name appeared again and again. Manufacturing. Technology. Transportation. Healthcare. The corporation's reach seemed endless. Michael stopped beside them. "I suppose this is the part where things become surprising." Ethan looked at him. "Surprising?" Michael smiled politely. Most people use stronger words. Ethan struggled to find any response. The elderly man he had helped find dinner and a safe ride home was apparently one of the most successful business leaders in the country. Lucy blinked several times. "The old man owns all of this." Michael laughed softly. "More or less." Wow. That single word captured the moment perfectly. Before anyone could say more, a familiar voice echoed from the far end of the hallway. "Lucy." The little girl turned instantly. Harold Bennett stood near the entrance to a sunlit sitting room. He looked different from the man Ethan had met outside the pharmacy. Not because of his clothes. Not because of the house. Because confidence had returned to his eyes. His posture seemed stronger. His smile brighter. Yet he was unmistakably the same person. Lucy ran forward without hesitation. "You remember me." Harold laughed warmly. "Of course I do." Ethan watched as Harold greeted her like an old friend. The sight felt strangely touching. Harold then turned toward Ethan. "And you came? You asked?" Harold nodded slowly. "I hoped you would." For a moment neither man spoke. Then Harold gestured toward the room behind him. "Please." They entered together. Large windows overlooked the estate grounds. Sunlight poured across bookshelves and comfortable chairs. Several executives occupied one side of the room. The moment Ethan entered, they stood. Every one of them. The gesture surprised him. He immediately looked behind himself, assuming someone more important had entered. Harold smiled. "They are standing for you." Ethan frowned. "Why?" Silence settled across the room. Then Harold Bennett looked directly at him and said the words that made every executive smile. "Because when everyone else saw an old man who seemed lost, you saw a human being worth helping." The room remained silent for several seconds after Harold Bennett spoke. Sunlight poured through the tall windows behind him, illuminating the faces of executives who managed divisions worth billions of dollars. Yet none of them seemed interested in financial reports or quarterly projections at that moment. Their attention remained fixed on Ethan Walker. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I think you are giving me too much credit." Several people smiled. Harold laughed softly. "That is exactly what I expected you to say." Lucy stood beside her father, looking around the room with open curiosity. "Dad helps everybody." The statement sounded simple, matter of fact, yet it somehow carried more weight than any speech. Harold's eyes brightened. "I know." He motioned for everyone to sit. A few moments later, coffee was served and the atmosphere relaxed. Yet Ethan still struggled to process everything he had learned. Finally, he looked directly at Harold. "I have to ask." Harold nodded. "Of course." Ethan glanced around the room. "You built all of this?" Harold smiled. "Over many years." "You founded the company?" "Yes." Ethan looked genuinely stunned. "And yesterday you were standing alone outside a pharmacy." Several executives exchanged quiet smiles. Harold's expression grew thoughtful. "Life has a way of reminding us who we are." Ethan leaned back slightly. "I'm not sure I understand." Harold folded his hands together. "Yesterday, nobody knew my title. No, nobody knew what I owned." "No," Harold nodded. "For a few hours, I experienced the world exactly as a stranger." Silence followed. "And?" Ethan asked. Harold looked directly at him. "Most people never saw me." The answer landed heavily in the room. Nobody argued. Nobody needed to. Harold continued. They were not cruel. No, Ethan agreed. Just busy. Exactly. Harold smiled sadly. Busy enough to keep walking. Ethan remembered the dozens of people who had passed by the bench. They had not been bad people. They simply had places to go, responsibilities, problems of their own. Yet the result had been the same. Harold had been alone. Then you stopped, Harold said quietly. Ethan shrugged. It felt like the right thing to do. Harold nodded. That answer tells me more about you than any resume ever could. Across the room, several executives exchanged thoughtful looks. One woman named Rebecca finally spoke. Mr. Walker, do you know how many people work for Bennett Global Enterprises? Ethan shook his head. No, just over 80,000. Ethan blinked. 80,000. Rebecca smiled. Across multiple countries. Lucy's eyes widened dramatically. That is a lot of employees. Laughter moved through the room. Harold smiled. It certainly is. Then his expression softened. But yesterday none of that mattered. He looked toward Ethan again. What mattered was character. The room fell quiet once more. Harold slowly reached into his jacket pocket and removed the envelope Ethan had seen in the diner. Do you remember this? Ethan nodded. Of course. Harold carefully opened it. My memory has improved significantly since last night. That is good. Very. Harold removed several pages and looked at them briefly. The meeting referenced in this letter happened this morning. Ethan glanced around the room. The important meeting? Harold smiled. Extremely important. Did it go well? Harold looked amused. That depends on how you define well. Ethan laughed. Fair enough. Harold continued. Part of the meeting involved succession planning. Ethan recognized the phrase immediately. It was one of the few details Harold had remembered the night before. Legacy planning, Ethan said. Harold nodded. Exactly. Several executives exchanged knowing glances. Ethan noticed them but did not understand their significance. Harold leaned forward slightly. For months, everyone in this room has been discussing the future of this company. The old founder paused. Who should lead it? What values should guide it? What kind of culture should survive long after I am gone? Ethan listened carefully. Harold's voice remained calm, but carried unmistakable authority. Yesterday provided an answer I was not expecting. The room became completely still. Even Lucy sensed something important was happening. Harold smiled warmly at her before looking back toward Ethan. You see, Ethan, when someone believes nobody is watching, that is when character reveals itself. Ethan felt increasingly uncomfortable being the center of attention. Harold, yes. I bought you soup. Several people laughed. Harold smiled broadly. Exactly. The answer surprised everyone. You bought soup for a stranger because it was the right thing to do. Harold's eyes reflected genuine admiration. Most people spend their lives trying to prove they are important. You never even tried. Outside the windows, autumn sunlight stretched across the estate grounds. Inside the room, a different realization was beginning to emerge. Ethan had arrived expecting answers about Harold Bennett. Instead, he was slowly discovering that Harold had invited him there for an entirely different reason. For several moments after Harold Bennett finished speaking, nobody in the room said a word. The silence was not uncomfortable. It felt respectful. Sunlight continued pouring through the tall windows, casting long golden reflections across polished wooden floors. Ethan Walker sat quietly beside Lucy, wishing he could somehow redirect the attention elsewhere. He had spent his entire life avoiding spotlights. Yet every person in the room seemed determined to place him directly beneath one. Harold noticed his discomfort and smiled. You are thinking about escaping. Laughter moved through the room. Ethan smiled sheepishly. Maybe a little. I suspected as much. Harold leaned back comfortably in his chair. That is another reason I like you. Ethan shook his head. Harold, I really do not understand why everyone keeps acting like I did something extraordinary. Harold looked around the room. Would anyone like to answer that? Rebecca smiled first. Then Michael. Then several others. Finally, an older executive named Thomas spoke. Because extraordinary things are usually much smaller than people imagine. Ethan frowned slightly. Thomas continued. People think character reveals itself during dramatic moments. He shook his head. Most of the time it reveals itself in ordinary ones. The room grew quiet again. Thomas smiled warmly. You saw someone who needed help and chose inconvenience instead of indifference. Ethan considered that. It still feels like a small thing. Harold nodded slowly. Exactly. The answer confused Ethan even more. Harold looked toward the executives seated nearby. Do you know what we discussed all morning? Ethan shook his head. Leadership. Harold paused. Responsibility. Another pause followed. Legacy. The old founder folded his hands together. Entire industries spend billions of dollars trying to identify people who can be trusted. Ethan listened carefully. Yet trust usually begins with simple decisions. Harold smiled, such as stopping to help a stranger. Lucy nodded proudly. I told him to do that. Laughter filled the room again. Harold pointed toward her. And that may have been the smartest advice anyone gave this week. Lucy beamed with satisfaction. Across the room, Michael stepped forward carrying a tablet. Sir, would you like me to show him? Harold nodded. Please. Ethan looked confused. Michael touched the screen and turned it toward him. Several security camera images appeared. Ethan immediately recognized the location. The pharmacy. What is this? Michael smiled gently. Part of our search. He moved through the footage. Image after image showed people passing Harold without stopping. Some glanced briefly. Others never noticed him at all. Then Ethan appeared, carrying grocery bags. Stopping. Turning around. Walking back. The footage continued through several angles. Ethan helping Harold sit down. Ethan speaking with him. Ethan staying. Ethan missing the bus. The room remained silent while the images played. Ethan felt strangely embarrassed watching himself. I look tired. Michael laughed softly. You probably were. Harold never took his eyes off the screen. That was the moment. Ethan looked at him. What moment? The moment I realized there was still plenty of hope left in the world. The words settled heavily in the room. Harold's voice remained calm, but emotion hid beneath every syllable. When memory becomes uncertain, many things begin to feel frightening. He glanced toward the windows. Yesterday was not one of my better days. No one interrupted. I knew something was wrong. I knew I was supposed to be somewhere important. Yet nothing made sense. Harold smiled faintly. Then a stranger sat down beside me and treated me like I mattered. Ethan looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. Harold noticed immediately. You still think this is about gratitude? Is it not? Harold shook his head. No. The room became still once more. Then what is it about? Ethan asked. Harold studied him carefully. Recognition. Ethan frowned. Recognition? Yes. Harold's eyes reflected decades of experience. The world often rewards money, influence, and titles. He gestured around the estate. I have spent most of my life surrounded by all three. The old founder paused. But character is rarer. Nobody spoke. Harold continued. Yesterday, I met a man who had every reason to keep walking. Ethan thought about overdue bills, long work hours, exhaustion, responsibilities. Harold was right. It would have been easier to keep walking. Yet you stayed. Harold smiled. Not because anyone was watching. Another pause. Because it was who you are. Outside, a gentle breeze moved through the estate gardens. Inside, something shifted emotionally across the room. The executives were no longer listening to a story about a lost elderly man. They were listening to a lesson about values, about dignity, about the quiet choices that reveal who people truly are. Harold eventually looked toward Lucy. Can I ask you something? She nodded eagerly. Sure. Why do you think your father stopped? Lucy answered without hesitation. Because he always does. The simplicity of the response seemed to affect everyone. Several executives smiled. Rebecca quietly looked away for a moment. Even Michael lowered his eyes. Harold laughed softly and shook his head. There it is. Ethan smiled. What? Harold pointed gently toward Lucy. The most honest character reference I have ever heard. The room remained quiet long after Lucy's answer. Because he always does. For simple words. Yet they seemed to carry more weight than the presentations, reports, and strategic plans that had filled the estate earlier that morning. Harold Bennett leaned back in his chair and smiled. That may be the most valuable thing anyone has said today. Lucy looked pleased with herself. Ethan shook his head. Do not encourage her. Why not? Harold asked. Because she already thinks she knows everything. Dad. Lucy gasped dramatically. Laughter spread through the room. The atmosphere had become noticeably lighter. Yet beneath the smiles and laughter, something important was still unfolding. Harold slowly stood and walked toward the large windows overlooking the grounds. The executives immediately became attentive. Not because he demanded it, because decades of leadership had taught them to listen when he became thoughtful. The old founder looked out across the gardens for several moments before speaking. When I started this company, I had almost nothing. Ethan listened carefully. Nothing. Harold smiled faintly. A small office. One desk. Too much optimism. Several executives laughed knowingly. There were months when I could barely afford payroll. Harold continued looking outside. There were years when success seemed impossible. He paused. But there was one thing I always believed. Nobody interrupted. Character matters. Harold turned back toward the room. Not talent alone. Not intelligence alone. Character. His eyes settled on Ethan. The problem is that character cannot be measured on a spreadsheet. The executives nodded. They had likely heard versions of this speech before. Yet today felt different. More personal. More real. Harold slowly returned to his chair. Yesterday reminded me of something I should never have forgotten. Ethan smiled. What is that? The people who quietly do the right thing are often the ones holding society together. Silence followed. Harold then looked toward Michael. Would you bring it in? Michael immediately nodded and disappeared through a side door. Ethan frowned slightly. Bring what in? Harold smiled. Patience. Lucy leaned closer to her father. Something mysterious is happening. Ethan laughed softly. I noticed. A minute later, Michael returned carrying a simple leather folder. Nothing flashy. Nothing dramatic. Yet the room seemed to understand its significance immediately. Michael handed it to Harold, who carefully placed it on the table. Then the old founder looked directly at Ethan. You have spent most of today wondering why I asked you here. That is true. Harold nodded. Part of the reason was gratitude. Ethan started to protest, but Harold raised a hand. Only part. The room became quiet again. The other reason, Harold continued, is because opportunities should sometimes follow character. Ethan blinked. Harold, hear me out. Harold opened the folder. Inside were several documents. He slid them across the table. Ethan glanced down, then looked again. The first page described a scholarship fund. The second outlined educational support. The third detailed mentorship programs and future opportunities. None of it appeared to involve money being handed to him directly. Instead, everything seemed focused on long-term stability and opportunity. Ethan looked confused. I do not understand. Harold smiled warmly. You once told me that your daughter is the most important thing in your life. Ethan nodded immediately. She is. Then I paid attention. Lucy stared at the documents. What is it? Harold looked toward her. It is a promise. The little girl tilted her head. What kind of promise? A promise that if you work hard, dream big, and stay the wonderful person you already are, you will never lack educational opportunities. Ethan looked up quickly. Harold, the old founder smiled. This is not charity. It feels like it. Harold shook his head. No, his voice remained gentle but firm. Charity is helping someone because they are struggling. He pointed toward the folder. This is investment. Ethan fell silent. Harold continued. I am investing in character. The words settled over the room. Several executives smiled. Rebecca quietly wiped at one eye before pretending to adjust her glasses. Michael looked away toward the windows. Even Thomas seemed emotional. Harold looked at Lucy again. Yesterday you helped a stranger through your father. Lucy blinked. I did. You certainly did. Harold smiled. And today I would like to help your future. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Outside, sunlight shimmered across the fountains. Inside, something far more meaningful was happening than a financial transaction. This was not a billionaire rewarding a good deed. It was an older man honoring values he believed should never disappear. Ethan looked down at the folder once more, then at Lucy, then back at Harold. His voice was quieter when he finally spoke. Why us? Harold's answer came without hesitation. Because yesterday, when nobody knew who I was, you reminded me who I wanted to be. For a long moment after Harold Bennett answered, nobody spoke. The afternoon sunlight seemed softer now, painting the room in warm shades of gold. Ethan Walker looked down at the folder resting in front of him, then toward Lucy, then back at the elderly man whose life had unexpectedly crossed his own. I do not know what to say. Harold smiled gently. You do not need to say anything. Ethan laughed quietly. That is convenient, because I am struggling to find words. The room relaxed again. Yet beneath the smiles, emotion lingered. Real emotion. The kind that cannot be purchased, negotiated, or manufactured. Harold slowly rose from his chair and walked toward the window. His reflection appeared faintly in the glass. For a moment, he looked older than before. Not weaker, simply thoughtful. A man measuring decades of success against a single unexpected evening. When I was young, Harold said quietly, I believed achievement would solve everything. Nobody interrupted. Then I believed influence would. He smiled faintly. Then wealth. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees surrounding the estate. Eventually, I learned something surprising. Ethan listened carefully. Harold turned back toward the room. The moments people remember most are rarely the expensive ones. Silence followed. They remember kindness. He glanced toward Ethan. They remembered dignity. Then toward Lucy. They remember grace. The room became completely still. Harold's eyes carried a warmth that had not been there the night before. Yesterday, I forgot many things. His voice softened. Names, appointments, details. He paused. But I remembered how it felt to be treated with respect. Ethan lowered his eyes. The words landed deeply. Harold smiled. That memory never left. A grandfather clock somewhere deeper inside the house quietly marked the passing hour. The sound echoed through the room. Then Harold surprised everyone. Would you both walk with me? A few minutes later, the three of them stepped outside into the autumn sunlight. The estate grounds stretched peacefully around them. Fountains sparkled. Leaves drifted across stone pathways. The world seemed quieter away from boardrooms and meetings. Harold moved slowly beside Ethan while Lucy walked ahead, investigating every flower and statue with endless curiosity. She reminds me of someone, Harold said. Ethan smiled. Who? Harold looked toward the little girl. The kind of person I used to be before life became complicated. They continued walking. Do you know something, Ethan? Harold asked. What? Yesterday may have been one of the most important days I've had in years. Ethan looked surprised. Because you got lost? Harold laughed warmly. Perhaps because I was found. They reached a small bench overlooking a pond. The same type of bench where their story had quietly begun. Harold sat down and motioned for Ethan to join him. Most people spend their lives chasing recognition. He watched the sunlight shimmer across the water. You spent yours earning respect. Ethan shook his head. I'm just trying to raise my daughter. Exactly, Harold smiled. And somehow that simple goal taught you things many successful people never learn. Lucy eventually returned and sat beside them. What are we talking about? Life, Harold answered. That sounds serious. It usually is. Lucy thought for a moment. I think life is mostly about helping people. Harold and Ethan exchanged a glance. Then both laughed. There it is again, Harold said. The wisdom. Lucy grinned proudly. As the afternoon slowly faded toward evening, something remarkable happened. Nobody discussed business. Nobody discussed money. Nobody discussed influence. They talked about family, memories, mistakes, second chances, ordinary things, important things, the kinds of conversations that quietly heal people. Eventually, it was time to leave. Ethan and Lucy walked with Harold back toward the front entrance. The long shadows of evening stretched across the grounds. At the door, Harold stopped and looked at them both. Thank you. Ethan smiled. For what? Harold's eyes softened. For reminding me that the world is still full of good people. Lucy hugged him before anyone could say another word. Harold laughed and returned the hug carefully. When she stepped back, his eyes glistened slightly. Take care of your father. I will, she promised. And you take care of yourself. I will try. As Ethan and Lucy drove away down the long driveway, neither looked back immediately. There was no need. Some endings do not feel like endings. They feel like beginnings. Harold stood at the entrance watching the truck disappear beyond the gates. The evening wind moved gently through the trees. For a long time, he remained there in silence. Then he smiled. Not because he had built a billion-dollar empire. Not because he had regained his memory. Not because of boardrooms, success, or legacy. He smiled because a struggling father had stopped to help a stranger without expecting anything in return. And in a world that often moves too fast to notice quiet acts of goodness, that simple choice had changed 3 lives. The remarkable thing was not that Ethan Walker eventually discovered who Harold Bennett was. The remarkable thing was that he helped him before he knew. And for a brief moment, beneath the fading light of an ordinary autumn evening, the noise of the world gave way to something far more powerful. Respect, grace, quiet dignity. Then, as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, everything became still.